Great. So today is, again, Friday, November 13th, Friday the 13th. Hopefully that does not mean that we will have bad luck with our lesson today. I'm knocking on wood. The title of today's lesson is Evidence of Evolution. And today is the fourth day of our 8th unit. So please make sure that you all are writing that down and making sure you're ready to take some good, efficient, effective, thorough, and comprehensive notes today. The objective of today's lesson is to explain how fossil, biochemical, and anatomical evidence support the theory of evolution. The essential question we seek to answer: what evidence of evolution is the most compelling? So I am recording this lesson, and I do want to take some time to acknowledge that all of our lessons are made publicly available to you all to go back and rewatch. I will send a link to that playlist where there are now 42 videos, 42 class recordings that are available to you all. I am slowly also starting to compile some shorter review videos in anticipation of some hard studying for the EOC exam, which will take place in about 4 weeks. So be on the lookout for more and more of those videos. In addition to that, we do have a remediation module that will be available to you all for those of you who would like to improve your first quarter grades. So there's a lot going on, but really I don't want to stress you all out because these are all opportunities for you to improve. These are all opportunities for you to get better and for your grades to get higher. So I would encourage you to just kind of seek through these opportunities, try to make sense of them. I am also encouraging you all to reach out to me as much as possible. I have not had as much outreach as I would like. I know that some of you are a bit confused about what's going on. I know that some of you feel kind of overwhelmed by the amount of work that you think there is right now, but trust me, it is all doable. There's enough time to do it. The assignments themselves don't take much time, nor do they take much effort, but they are important. They're important for two reasons. Number one, they're important because they are worth points, and those points are going into PowerSchool. Number two, they are important because in this time of virtual learning, what we're doing right now is just one part of the class. This is just the synchronous portion of the class. And ultimately, this synchronous portion, while it is important, is not going to be worth any points. And it's only one half of the instruction. The other half of the instruction, meaning the portion of the class where you are learning about the biological concepts, comes asynchronously. And what I mean by that is those are the assignments that we give to you all at the end of the class, which you can do on your own time, but you need to do them because they ultimately are there to help you understand the concept. They are designed to supplement the live lesson. Okay, so this is just a lecture portion of the class. And yes, we do ask questions and try to answer some sample questions. But in addition to that, you all still have the responsibility and the obligation to do those asynchronous assignments, which are also there to help you. Okay, so I'm seeing quite a few of you still struggle to get those done on time. They are set up so that for each unit, they're not due until the last day of the unit, which means that all of our Unit 8 assignments are due on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, the 18th. So you still have 5 days to do those, but don't wait until Tuesday to try to start, okay? Because although they don't take much time, they do take more time than what you can probably dedicate in one night. All right, so we're going to talk more about the assignments at the end of the lesson, but I did want to say that don't be discouraged, guys. We still have time. I need you to work with me. I'm working hard. I'm trying to put in time to make sure you all have all the materials that you need to be successful. I'd like to see some of you all step it up a little bit more too. Okay. That being said, there are still quite a few of you who have not taken the Unit 7 test. I know that some of you had technical difficulties. Some of you weren't present for that lesson, but this is still a big deal because the unit tests are really some of the only formal grades that go into the grade book. This means that they are worth a lot more than the other informal assignments. So to have a 0 go into the grade book for a test is really, really going to hurt your grade. So if you know that this is you, and I do have the list of, I do have the list of students who have not yet taken the test. Are any of you on this call? Yes, there are a couple of you on the call right now who still need to take the test. If you know that this is you, please reach out to me so we can find a time to go ahead and take care of that. All right, because you do not want that 0 going into the grade. We did take that test last Friday, so it's been a week already, and I haven't heard from you. So we need to go ahead and take care of that, because the reason I haven't put everybody else's grades into the grade book is because the way I curve the test depends on the majority of people having taken it. Right now, I still have 21 students across both of my classes who have not taken the test. So the average right now is not an accurate reflection of all the test takers, which is throwing everybody else's grades off as well. So even if you're not happy about taking the test, at least you can do it for your classmates. So please do reach out to me so we can schedule a time to take that test. All right, so in your warm-up just now, you had this question, and I think this question provides a great opportunity for a review because it covers a lot of different topics. So it says, eukaryotic autotrophs contain both chloroplasts and mitochondria within their cells. Which best describes how these two organelles are dependent on one another in these specific organisms? So I think this is a great question because it brings up a lot of different cross-cutting concepts, but we still need to know what this question is asking because it's got some big words here, some pretty unique biology words and phrases. The first one is eukaryotic autotrophs. What does that mean? What is a eukaryotic autotroph? And some of you I know hesitate to answer because you're like, oh, I'm always the one who's talking. Let's not worry about that. I want to move through this quickly. So someone please take yourself off of mute and tell me, what is a eukaryotic autotroph?
A complex cell that can do photosynthesis.
Good, yes, this is a complex or complete cell that does photosynthesis. Really, this is a fancy way of saying plants. Okay, so eukaryotic cells are more complex because they have nuclei. Autotrophs are organisms that make their own food because they do photosynthesis. They use energy from the sun to make glucose. So that's what is packed into that one two-word phrase. Okay, a lot of information comes from that, and this is how you all have to attack the test. You've got to pick out as much information as possible from each of these words and phrases and use that before you look at the answer choices to make a prediction about what the answer might be. So we know that now. Thank you, Alicia. The other words that I think are important, chloroplasts and mitochondria. What is a chloroplast? What is a chloroplast? Ayana, I heard you come off of mute. Give it a try.
That's the thing that's responsible for photosynthesis.
Exactly, yes. This is the organelle that is inside of plant cells that does photosynthesis. Excellent. And what about a mitochondria, or a mitochondrion is the singular version? And that's not directed at any one specific person, so anyone can jump in and answer. What is a mitochondrion? I know several of you know this answer.
The organelle that helps make ATP.
Excellent. Yes, the mitochondria make ATP. They are the site of cellular respiration. Okay. So they make energy for the cell. They are the cell's powerhouse. They are the powerhouse of the cell. So we're thinking about these two things. One of them does photosynthesis, one of them does cellular respiration. And the question is asking us, how are those organelles dependent on one another How are they dependent on one another? And we're asking about in these specific organisms. So we're thinking about plants. How do chloroplasts and mitochondria depend on one another in plants? Does anybody have any prediction before we look at the answer choices? We know that chloroplasts, go ahead, Alicia, I'm sorry.
The chloroplast makes glucose, which then goes to the mitochondria, which helps make its ATP.
Excellent. Chloroplasts make glucose. They make the food for plants. Obviously, plants don't have mouths and hands and mobile ability to go eat their own food. They have to make it for themselves. And the food they make is called glucose. Chloroplasts make the glucose, and that glucose is then transported to the mitochondria where it is used to make energy. So just like food provides our bodies with energy, in plants, their food, glucose, provides their bodies with energy. Okay, so that's the relationship. We have a prediction now, the correct prediction, I will say, before we even look at the answer choices. So if you all can get in the habit of doing that, I can guarantee you your test scores will go up. They will go up. But let's look at the answer choices. A, the chloroplasts use carbon dioxide to produce oxygen, which is then used by the mitochondria for anaerobic respiration. That's an enticing answer, and I'll talk about why in a minute. Thanks for joining us, Joseph. B, the mitochondria are responsible for providing the genetic instructions, and the chloroplasts are the organelles responsible for making the proteins coded by the genetic instructions. That's just totally off. We know that when we see genes, what part of the cell should we be thinking about? When we see genes, which organelle should we be thinking about?
The nucleus?
Thank you, Gabby. Excellent. Yes, the nucleus. And then when we see proteins, which organelle should we be thinking about?
Ribosome?
Ribosomes. Good. So we shouldn't be thinking mitochondria and chloroplasts when we're talking about genes and proteins. We should be thinking about genes being located in the nucleus, which houses all of our DNA. And we should be thinking about ribosomes because they make proteins. So B, totally wrong. C, the chloroplast is responsible for creating glucose through photosynthesis. Then the mitochondria use that glucose to produce ATP through respiration. That's exactly what Alicia said. So that is the correct answer, but let's take a look at answer choice D. The mitochondria use the process photosynthesis to create glucose, and then the chloroplasts use that glucose to create ATP through respiration. So that's the inverse. That's the opposite of the correct answer. That's a tricky one. You got to be sure about which does which. Does the chloroplast do photosynthesis or does the mitochondria? Does the mitochondria do cellular respiration or do the chloroplast? So you have to be sure because they will try to trip you up and provide you with the exact same answer, but written inversely. But in this case, C is the correct answer. I do want to take a look at A quickly, though, because A is actually not a bad answer, except for one thing. A says the chloroplasts use carbon dioxide to produce oxygen. That's true. Chloroplasts do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, and it also produces oxygen. So that first part of this sentence is correct. And then it says that oxygen is then used by the mitochondria for anaerobic respiration. Okay, we do know that mitochondria use oxygen. They do need oxygen to make energy. The tricky part of this answer choice is that it says anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic is a word that means without oxygen. So that was a close answer choice. If you delete those two letters, A and N, then you're ending up with another correct answer. But you got to be careful. Anaerobic means without oxygen. So that's the only incorrect portion of that sentence. All right, so a quick review from yesterday. No need to take any notes here. But yesterday we talked about natural selection. Natural selection is the idea that individuals with the most suitable adaptations survive and reproduce. A population needs genetic variation in order for natural selection to occur. Now, all populations have genetic variation because sexually reproducing organisms undergo meiosis, and meiosis guarantees that no two sperm cells and no two egg cells are going to be alike. That means that every offspring, even if two organisms have 500 children, which of course does happen in some insect populations, or in some fish populations, you might end up with 500 eggs. Even in that case, none of the resulting 500 offspring are going to be exactly alike. Obviously, they will be very genetically similar, but they won't be exactly alike because of this meiosis. So genetic variation is guaranteed whenever we're talking about a sexually reproducing population. We also talked about the fact that geographic isolation causes speciation. That means that when two populations from the same species get separated for one reason or another, maybe it's because of a drought or flooding or because of Pangea's supercontinent being broken apart. Whenever we see two different populations arise from the same species, it's likely that those two populations will eventually split and become two different species as they adapt to their new environments, as they compete for different resources. So that's a quick review of yesterday. Natural selection is really quite fascinating, and it's foundational when we talk about evolution. And today we're talking about evidence of evolution. So the first definition that you should write down is fossil evidence. Fossil evidence is great evidence of evolution. Correct. Yes, Adrian. At some point, and let me find this image first. All right, really quickly, I'm sorry. I know some of you were probably writing down the definition, but I want to respond to Adrian's question. So we can see here that 4.5 million years ago, we don't know exactly when this species came about, and we also don't know exactly when they went extinct, but they did exist about 4.4 million years ago. All of these hominid species had one common ancestor called Ardipithecus ramidus. Ardipithecus ramidus. Not sure how to pronounce that, but over time, this singular species created this family tree essentially of other hominid species. So these hominids are organisms that have collarbones, they have opposable thumbs, they walk on their hind legs, on just two hind legs, and they also have relatively flat faces. So all of these different species, which are characterized by those similarities, came out of this one species. And we can see here Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. So these were the Neanderthals. They existed not long ago, only about 250 to 300,000 years ago. Of course, Homo sapiens didn't arise until about 150,000 years ago. And of course, we are the only remaining hominid species. We are the only species of man that still exists today. But there was Homo erectus, a long surviving ancestor that lasted for over 1 million years before they went extinct. And we, again, don't know exactly when that happened. But we can see that there are and we have fossil records of these hominid species. most of which are located in Eastern Africa, which is how we have come to speculate that Eastern Africa was the origin of human species. So because of different reasons, for example, we talked a little bit about this, but Homo erectus was the first species we speculate to leave the continent of Africa, the first species of man to leave the continent of Africa. Once it did, it went through Saudi Arabia, which is today Saudi Arabia, and through the Middle East. What happened was that for whatever reason, one population of Homo erectus went west into Europe. Another population of Homo erectus went east and towards Asia. The population that went west became the Neanderthals. The population that went east eventually became the Homo sapiens. Now, you obviously did still have some mixing between these two populations, the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens. And so even today, there are people who are descended from Europe who have some Neanderthal DNA in their genome. And that's not to say that anybody of European descent is a caveman, or that's not what that means. What this means is that they still have some genetic markers from this earlier species of man. They are still Homo sapiens, but they do have some earlier. It's likely that, you know, many thousands of years ago, someone in their lineage, a Homo sapien, mated with a Homo Neanderthal. And so it's interesting that we can look at all these. We can look at fossil records, and then, like I just said, we can also look at genetic records, the biochemistry, to determine this ancestry. But we'll talk more about that. So good question.
Oh wait, I had a question.
Yes.
So when you looked at the pictures and you looked at the little skulls and the green bars, every the scientists found out how they ended except for the Homo erectus.
They don't. There's not an exact. We don't know exactly how. The question marks that you were seeing in the green bars means we don't know when. So we can look at fossil records and have a general idea, as well as, and not just human fossil records, but we can look at fossil records from things, even like plant species, to know that, okay, well, at some point, and even geology, we can look at rocks and see that, well, in this area where Homo habilis, we know they occupied this specific area in Central Africa, but in the year 200,000 or even before that, BC, we can look at the geology and know that there was a drought that wiped out that population. So this is not just a matter of looking at any one specific species fossils. We look at all of the plant fossils. We look at the other animal fossils. We look at the rock record, the geology, and we can put together this composite idea of what probably happened. And that's what science is. It's not necessarily coming to an exact conclusion, but it's using, even statistically, we can say this is 95% likely that this happened. Never can you really say you are 100% sure that this explains this. That's very, very rare. Even if you get 95% close to that answer, even if you can say there's a 95% chance that this caused this, or that these two things are related, they are correlated, that's a very high confidence interval. That's a high level of confidence. Oftentimes in science, you might only be 80% sure. You might only be 85% sure. So we don't know for sure, but we can have a composite idea based on the fossil records, based on what we know to have been the climate at the time, based on what other animal and plant species existed at that time. We can come together and put all of those facts together and have a composite idea of what may have happened. Okay. But yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
How did the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens mate if they're both different species?
So this would have been very early on in their speciation, when they would have still had. Now, I think what you're getting at is the fact that we typically don't consider something to be its own species until it no longer has mating capabilities with another species, meaning that when they have children, even if they do have an offspring, that offspring cannot have its own children. For example, the liger. The reason we consider a lion and a tiger two different species, even though they technically can mate, is that a liger cannot have its own children. So you can't have a colony of ligers. So I think that's what you're getting at. But what likely happened is very, very early on in the speciation process, when they were starting to have some genetic differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, they were still geographically, the proximity, they were still close enough geographically to overlap. Those populations may have overlapped, and genetically they were starting to be differentiated, but not quite. So when I say that there are traces of that Neanderthal DNA, again, those people are still Homo sapiens, but they might have very, very small portions of their genome that resembled what eventually became Neanderthal DNA. Good questions. You guys are inquisitive today. I love it. All right, but we can look at these fossils, and it gives us a really strong idea about the past, and not only about our ancestors, but also about Pangea. For example, we can look and see that there were fossils that now we find in Uruguay and in Argentina in South America, but we find very similar species or the exact same species in South Africa. Obviously, Uruguay and South Africa are, separated by the Atlantic Ocean today, which, it's just not possible that a land-dwelling species would have been able to get all the way from South Africa to South America unless those two continents at some point were connected, were conjoined. And so these fossil records also provide us evidence of a supercontinent that we have come to know as Pangea. And Adrian, I also saw your message about your dad not believing that we evolved. There are a lot of people who don't believe that, and that's not a bad thing. We just have to recognize that there is evidence that the theory of evolution is correct. And that's what this lesson is about. This is evidence. Now, it doesn't prove anything. It's like I said, it's very rare in science that you can prove something. Even gravity, we call gravity a law because there are huge amounts of evidence that support that gravity exists. But it's impossible to know that gravity has always existed. We don't know that 3 million years ago, gravity only existed in some places and didn't exist in other places. It's impossible for us to know that. But we can be 99% sure that gravity has always existed because of basically the size of Earth. And so we call it a law. But evolution is still a theory. It's a theory with a lot of evidence, but we can't be 100% sure that this explains everything that has happened. So some people have belief systems that allow them to come to other conclusions, that perhaps we are all the results of a single creator. Some people are able to merge those two thoughts and say, well, there's still room for evolution in my religion. So it's just a matter of, what your belief system is and which evidence you give credence to. You do sometimes see, we talked a little bit about it yesterday. You do sometimes see, I'm going to go to the next slide so you all can start writing this down. But you do sometimes see evidence of converging evolution. So you will sometimes see that different species start to converge and develop similar characteristics. For example, I think I shared this with you all at the beginning of the school year, but I read an article about 5 different species of crustaceans eventually evolving to become crabs. They all became crabs. So that's fascinating. And the reasons for that are not fully understood. We don't know exactly why they converged upon one another and became very similar species. However, it is possible. Nature does allow that to happen. It really is a matter of what traits are going to prove to be beneficial in a specific ecosystem. And so if it became true one day that the gorillas that still exist in specific South Asian and South American forests, if it became true one day that they started to develop specific traits, like, they needed to be more land dwelling instead of living in the trees, then we might start to see them develop more, develop traits that are more similar to humans. Like, we might start to see more of them choosing solely to walk on their hind two legs. But none of us will be able to witness that in our lifetime. None of us will have family members really, in the next 30 generations that will see anything like that. It's more likely that humans will continue to evolve to incorporate specific technologies into our human experience than it is that we'll see gorillas become humans again. And that's not exact. Yeah, that's not. I shouldn't even use that language. It's not that gorillas became humans. It's that over many millions of years, as we saw, many different species came out of a common ancestor, and these changes were gradual. All right, but fossils provide evidence that life evolved from simple to more complex forms. It also moved from water to land, and it existed over 4 billion years ago. So life has existed for quite some time, but of course, we're not talking about complex life. We're talking initially about, single-celled organisms that were autotrophic, or they were heterotrophic, I'm sorry, but they were literally they were surviving on, molecules, macromolecules. So the fossil on the far left was taken from one of the earliest land-dwelling photosynthetic plants. So some of the earliest photosynthetic plants still existed in marine environments. They lived underwater. And there's plenty of evidence that some of the earliest photosynthetic organisms were algae and coral. So for this plant to then make the move onto land was a big deal. And it also represented that the ozone layer was forming, because one of the reasons that life could not exist on land for a long time was because the sun was simply too harsh. The UV radiation would have killed anything that existed on land. So the fact that these plants began to move onto land symbolized, or represents the ozone layer. And this fossil is from a species that dominated the landscape for about 40 million years. They were some of the only plants that existed for about 40 million years. And almost all of the currently existing plants are descendants of this plant. I don't remember the exact species name, the exact scientific name, but this was a very important discovery. The middle image is a fossil of a fish with fins that is joined to its body by a single bone. And so this was a precursor of tetrapods. We're going to look at another image of this organism a little bit later. But a tetrapod, of course, is a species or an organism that has 4 limbs. And so most of the organisms that we know exist on our Earth today are tetrapods. And so that includes humans, and we have this, there's not evidence that we are direct descendants of this fish, but they are representative of probably one of our last sea-dwelling ancestors. And then the image on the right are the Laetoli footprints taken from what is now Eastern Africa, Eastern African countries. These footprints are 3.7 million years old, and they were left by an ancient ancestor of humans. These ancestors walked through some basically wet volcanic ash. And so they left imprints in that ash. It was essentially like sand, but what's different about the ash is that it doesn't, sand will eventually converge upon itself, so that the traces will disappear. This eventually hardened, and this is now a fossil record. We know that these were some of the earliest ancestors of humans because their thumbs were in a direct line with the with the middle of their bodies. So if you think about gorillas, their footprints, they have toes, they have big toes that are not, they face the opposite direction of the other toes. The reason for that is so that they can grab branches much more easily and swing in the trees. These footprints have a big toe that is in the direct line of the middle of their bodies. So this indicates that these organisms, this species of hominids, were primarily walking on their back feet. And that's proof, or not proof, but that's evidence that they are an ancient ancestor of humans. Pretty cool stuff.
What are the size of the footprints?
The size of the footprints?
Yeah.
Let's see.
Like, are they really small or big?
Yeah, 40 millimeters. I'm not sure how many inches that is. Let's see. Oh, they're small. That's only an inch and a half. That can't be right. Hold on. I will research that and get back to you. That's an inch and a half sounds too small. Yeah, I'll get back to you on that one, Gabby. Good question. All right, so we typically obviously find fossils in rocks, embedded in rocks. And also because, as we know, Earth for the majority of, well, life for the majority of its existence on Earth existed only in water. We also know that most of Earth was at one point covered by water. Even the Grand Canyon at one point was totally submerged. So the cool thing about it is that as the glaciers receded, as they started to move towards the poles, and as land emerged, we can still see within these rock layers that there are fossils that would have at one point existed only underwater. But if we look at these rock layers, which one would be the oldest and which one is the youngest?
D will be oldest and A will be youngest.
Excellent, yeah. So the oldest layers, of course, eventually get submerged under the newer layers as new rock formations come and take over. And also, as we think about the tectonic plates that exist just under the surface of the Earth, there's a constant submersion process that takes place. And so new rock is always going to come on top of older rock. All right. So another type of evidence, we have 4 types. Second type we'll talk about is comparative anatomy. And comparative anatomy are organs and skeletal structures that appear in the bodies of various species across multiple phyla and classes, suggesting a common ancestor. So when we see different anatomical structures like organs and bones that basically have the same function, they look the exact same, but they exist in totally different species, that is evidence that at one point those species have a common ancestor. So this is Tiktaalik rosei, and it lived 375 million years ago. And it represents the transition from fish to early tetrapods. So this would have been one of the earliest amphibians on Earth. And here are some of its characteristics. This organism has wrist joints, which is very uncommon for fish. You don't see that really appearing in fish. It also has rib bones and lungs that would have allowed it to breathe outside of water for a portion of time. It also has an ear region. Now, it didn't have hearing capabilities like you and I have, and definitely not the hearing capabilities that some species have today, like dogs and bats, but it had some hearing capabilities. And it had a mobile neck, which means that it could move its head without moving the rest of its body. which is, if you think about it, not super common outside of tetrapods. Fish don't have that ability. So let's do a quick scientific name review. We did introduce these scientific names in the last unit when we talked about the classification of species. What is that? The tiktaalik part of the name. What would that represent? Of our 8 levels, we've got kingdom or domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Which of those 8 levels is that first word, tiktaalik? Yes, thank you, Gabby. That's the genus. So in scientific name, whenever we're writing the scientific name of species, we always write the genus first, and the genus is capitalized always. And then what's the second part? Rosi. What's that second part? Which of the 7 remaining levels is that? It's the most specific level. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time. So species, that is the species. So when we're writing the scientific names, the genus always comes first, and it gets capitalized, and then it's followed by the species. Both of those words need to be italicized, which means that, you write them slanted like this. So that's the correct way to write a scientific name. Okay. So in addition, one specific type of comparative anatomy that we can look at are homologous structures. So homologous structures are similar anatomic features between different species, and these are suggestive of a common ancestor. So we can see we've got 4 species here, and we wouldn't consider these species to be similar really at all. Although the brains of dolphins and the brains of humans are actually they do have some similarities. But we've got humans, dogs, dolphins, and a type of bat. We can see that we all have that humerus bone, which is the bone that's in your upper arm. And if you think about it, that's why we call it, if you ever hit your elbow, you say, oh, you just hit your funny bone. That's because it's your humerus, and it's got nerve endings at the end of the humerus, right here in your elbow. And so if you hit the bone right there, it does hurt. It's not funny. But we've got a radius, which is the bone that is closer to the middle of your body. So you've got 2 bones in your lower arm, your radius and your ulna. Actually, if you're standing in the correct anatomical position with your palms facing forward, the ulna is going to be closer to the middle of your body. It's on your pinky side. Your radius is facing outward. It's on your thumb side. But we can see those same bones also in other species. The carpals are the bones of your wrist. So if you've ever heard someone say they fractured their wrist, there are in humans about 8 bones in the wrist. So it could be any one of those 8 bones that's fractured, or it could be multiple of those bones. The metacarpals are what we would typically consider the palm of your hand, and then your phalanges. Your phalanges could be the toe. They could be your toes, or they could be your fingers. All right, but we see those same structures across species. you're interested in learning more about this, anatomy is a pretty cool class too. And then another type of comparative anatomy are vestigial structures. And these are structures that may have had some function for our ancestors. They may have had some important function for our ancestors, but they do nothing for the currently living species. So for example, humans, we have ear muscles. Some of us will actually have the ability to control those ear muscles, and you can move your ear up and down a little bit. Or actually, if you try to move your eyebrow, you should also feel your ear move a little bit. The reason for that is that, if think about a dog, some of you have dogs at home. Your dog, if you make a noise, it sometimes won't move its entire head. It'll just move its ear to face the noise. The theory is that one of humans' ancestors also needed that ability to move its ear towards the noise, better hear. So that's why we still have those ear muscles. Wisdom teeth, tonsils, these are other examples. Your appendix is another example of an organ that you don't need. It does nothing for us. The coccyx is the bone that's at the very bottom of your spine, and that is a remnant of a tail. Of course, most humans do not have tails. So really that coccyx, which most of us can actually feel, if you feel just right at the, if you can feel the bottom of your spine, you can feel that coccyx. That would have been where a tail would have grown from. And it's also, again, not needed. It doesn't really provide any function, does not provide any function for humans. And so all of these things, in fact, you've heard people getting appendicitis, which is a painful condition in which the appendix becomes inflamed and swollen, and it can actually burst. So that's pretty dangerous. So people will often have appendectomies, which means that they get their appendix removed. You'll often hear people, a little bit older than you, maybe some of you have already done it actually, getting their wisdom teeth removed. People who struggle with, what is it called? Strep throat. People who get a lot of streptococcus infections will get their tonsils removed.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So, like, thousands of years ago, was wisdom teeth actually, like, in the skull? It was used for something?
They were just another, they provided more chewing ability when when our jaws were bigger, and when we needed more grinding ability in the back of our mouth. Now we're fine with the molars that we have.
Okay.
Great. The third type of evidence, and the most compelling type of evidence, is comparative biochemistry. This is the analysis of DNA or proteins for similarities between two different species in order to determine their common ancestry. So we can literally look at the genome of different species and see that there are similar regions, similar genes that exist across species. We can, again, sometimes we get lucky and we have extractable DNA from a fossil, and we can analyze that DNA. Perhaps you've heard that it is an ongoing debate in the scientific community whether or not we should bring back some extinct species like the woolly mammoth. Now that we have the ability to basically cut and paste DNA, it would be a relatively simple process to impregnate an elephant with a woolly mammoth. Now, it might not be possible in one generation. It might take a few generations of elephants in order for a successful birth, but it is possible with the technology that we currently have. So it's kind of a debate. Is that ethically right? Would the Arctic ecosystem suffer if we brought back woolly mammoths. But of course, woolly mammoths and Asian elephants share a great amount of DNA, so it's definitely not impossible. Okay. Let me know if I need to come back to that slide. But you may remember us talking about these DNA fingerprints in Unit 6, which was a few weeks ago. So the question is, we've got a species 1, and we have collected samples from 2 other species. We want to know which of those 3 species is most similar to species 1. Now, you can probably look at this, and just with your naked eye, you can probably see which species is most similar, most closely related. But let's do it. Let's figure this out scientifically. So the more DNA bands, which are represented by these gray or black rectangles, the more DNA bands that a species has in common with species 1, the more similar or the more closely related it is to species 1. So I'm going to count the number of similarities. With that first band, all 3 of the species 2, 3, and 4, have that band in common with species 1. Same thing with the second band. The third band is only shared by species 3. So now species 3 is in the lead. Keep going. Okay. So species 3 has 8 bands in common with species 1 versus only 5 bands from species 2 and species 4. So species 3 is most closely related to species 1. I never thought I'd say species that many times. All right, and then the last type of evidence is comparative embryology. And this is when we analyze the development of embryos, and that will indicate common ancestry. So most mammals do look pretty similar in the very earliest stages of development. So just looking at this, can you start to tell? Can you determine the species? Does anybody have any guesses about any of these species?
I don't know, but the second one kind of reminds me of a tadpole for some reason.
Okay. So we've got a tadpole guess. Anything else?
What is it?
What was that? All right, let's take a look. So I think you were right about the tadpole, Ayana. I think salamanders are, they start off as tadpoles. We've also got fish. We've got a tortoise, a chicken, and a human being. So we can see that in the earliest stages, all of these embryos have gill slits, but only 2 of them end up actually having gills, the fish and the salamander. The tortoise initially does not have the shell, but eventually it does grow a shell. And even the human starts off with a tail, but of course this tail eventually will fuse in many ways and become the spine. So interesting stuff. What's the process that happens in the early stages of embryonic development to create different tissues and organs. What's that process called? We talked about it in Unit 5. What's that process called? I'll give you another hint. When cells end up getting different jobs, they get assigned different jobs. What's that process called?
Cell specialization?
Excellent. Cell specialization. Wonderful. Okay, one practice question and then we'll be done. Which of the following provides the most compelling evidence for the theory of evolution? Fossils, biochemistry, comparative anatomy, or comparative embryology? I think I did say this explicitly because I knew this question was coming up. So which one provides the most compelling evidence, meaning the strongest evidence? The most convincing evidence?
B.
Yep. Biochemistry. DNA is the strongest type of evidence. Oh, let's watch this video.
Your body is a temple, but it's also a museum of natural history. Look closely and you'll see parts that aren't there because you need them, but because your animal ancestors did. No longer serving their previous function, but not costly enough to have disappeared. These remnants of our deep history only make sense within the framework of evolution by natural selection. With your arm on a flat surface, push your thumb against your pinky and tip your hand slightly up. If you see a raised band in the middle of your wrist, you've got a vestigial muscle in your forearm. That tendon you see connects to the palmaris longus, a muscle that around 10 to 15% of people are missing on one or both of their arms. It doesn't make them any weaker though. There's no difference in grip strength. In fact, it's one of the first tendons that surgeons will take out so that they can use it in reconstructive and cosmetic surgeries. You can find the palmaris longus across mammal species, but it's most developed among those that use their forelimbs to move around. In primates, that means the muscle is longer in lemurs and monkeys and shorter in chimps, gorillas, and other apes that don't do a lot of scrambling through trees. It's not the only leftover muscle that we've got. Look at the 3 that are attached to our outer ear. We can't get much movement out of these muscles, especially compared to some of our mammal relatives who use them to locate the sources of sounds. Presumably, this would have been quite helpful for early nocturnal mammals. In humans, you can still detect the remnants of this adaptation with electrodes. In one study, researchers recorded a spike of activity in the ear muscle cells in response to a sudden sound. Not enough to move the ear, but detectable. And you can probably guess the location of the sound based on these results. It came from a speaker placed to the left of the study subjects. So this is their left ear subconsciously trying and failing to pivot toward the sound. You can see another futile effort by our vestigial body parts when you get goosebumps. When we're cold, tiny muscles attached to our body hairs contract, pulling the hair upright, which causes the surrounding skin to form a bump. For our furry mammal relatives, the raised hair increases the amount of space for insulation, helping them stay warm. Birds can do this too. You've probably seen a puffy pigeon on a cold day. Adrenaline is one of the hormones involved in the body's response to cold temperatures, and it's also part of the fight or flight response. So it helps some animals appear larger when they're threatened. And it may be why surprising and emotional turns in music can give some people goosebumps. And then there's our tail. At the end of our spine are a set of fused vertebrae. Some people have 3, some people have 5. We call it the tailbone. It now serves as an anchor for some pelvic muscles, but it's also what's left of our ancestors' tails. Every one of us actually had a tail at one point when the basic body plan is being laid out at around 4 weeks of gestation. Human embryos closely resemble embryos of other vertebrates, and that includes a tail with 10 to 12 developing vertebrae. In many other animals, it continues to develop into a proper tail. But in humans and other apes, the cells in the tail are programmed to die a few weeks after they appear. Very rarely, though, a mutation allows the ancestral blueprint to prevail, and a human baby will be born with a true vestigial tail. The most adorable vestigial behavior is the palmar grasp reflex, where infants up until they're about 6 months old have this incredible grasp on whatever you put in their hand. There's a similar reflex for their feet. I wanted to show you this great piece of footage from the 1930s where they demonstrated this behavior. These babies are only 1 month old, and you can see that their inner monkey can support their entire weight.
Okay. So there is an asynchronous assignment. There is an exit ticket. I know we only have 7 minutes. The asynchronous assignment is actually pretty short. The first question is longer than the others. The questions after the first question probably won't take you any time at all. So you can knock that out, or you can knock out the exit ticket, or you can knock out maybe the Kahoot, because the only people who I can see did the Kahoot in this class are Alicia, and that's it. So quite a few of you still have work to do. I'm going to send the URL to the Kahoots into the chat right now. We have 6 minutes and I will be here. Please do use this weekend to get caught up, because the test is coming on Wednesday. Do not be left with majority of your assignment still outstanding on Wednesday. I know some of you have reached out to me and told me your circumstances. I appreciate that. But for those of you who have not, I'm expecting that you will have everything done by Wednesday.
Here, I'll get it done, but I gotta go, okay?
Okay, have a good weekend.
All right, you too.
Sell your car now.
Okay, so it is now 11:35. You all are good to go and enjoy your lunch break. If you need anything over the weekend, I know some of you have quite a bit of work to do. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and I will talk to you all on Monday.